Test, test, test. Test, test.
All right, it's 5 o'clock. We need to take attendance, correct? So, all right. Here.
Present.
Okay, all right, so first on the agenda is, oh yeah, we do need to excuse. I will take a motion. Commissioner Attendee.
Excuse Commissioners Morris and Commissioner Overshaw.
Any objections? Or seconds? I say first one, so. All right, perfect. All right, first on the agenda is Government Budgeting 101. We have a presentation. Floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Welcome to Budget 101, and hopefully this presentation will at least give you a little bit of a flavor of governmental budgeting. It is different than a for-profit entity, dramatically different, to be quite honest. So with that, I'll just get started. First off, what we're going to do is talk about the budget process, how that process has worked in the past, and what we're expecting for this year. And then we'll talk about the city funds. And again, the fund accounting is a real big difference from like a for-profit entity. And we'll talk about general fund departments, so we at least have some idea of what's in there. General fund revenues give you a little bit of flavor there as well. General fund expenditures, restricted funds, what those consist of and what some of the restrictions are. And finally, we're going to go through the budget book and look at the different sections and of course, answer any questions that may come up along the way. So moving on, the budget process. First off, the city charter states that the city manager shall prepare and submit an annual budget and capital program to the commission for its approval and administer the budget adopted by the commission. And then further, a resolution was adopted on July 12th back in 2004 that says that the proposed budget shall be prepared and delivered to the City Commission on or before the third Monday of April. And I'm not sure what the May is up in there, but, and that has been what we have done is delivered the budget on the third March, or the third meeting in March, April.
Third meeting?
The third week, third Monday, I apologize. So to start off the budget process, what happens is in early January, I send a memorandum to all departments, basically giving them the departments that they're responsible for, giving them any type of updates on fringe benefits or rates, and just basically kind of formally initiating the budget, saying that the information is out there in New World. Just to give you a little background, we use our accounting system, New World Financials, to basically compile the budget process, compile all the numbers by department. We also have a lot of detail in there, as well as all the personnel costs, et cetera. And that's generally out there, at least the personnel costs are out there at the time that they get this memo. And then they fill in all the details of what they're going to spend for capital outlay, what they're going to spend for professional services, office supplies, you name it. And there's a lot of detail in there. So we send that out to them, and then the departments then take over. They go ahead and put together their requests for the next year. using the numbers that my department, in conjunction with Human Resources, put together for all their personnel costs. And once that's done, they, once the deadline is ended, and it's roughly the 1st of March that deadline is, then my department goes ahead and compiles all the information and comes up with ultimately a magic number in terms of how much over the revenues are over expenditures, or generally the other way around, how much expenditures are over revenues. And that's when the real work starts. We set up meetings between the city manager, myself, and my assistant, as well as the department head and whoever they want to come. And then we go through their budget literally with a fine-tooth comb, looking at literally every line item and seeing if it's reasonable in comparison to previous year's budgets, if it's really doing what we want to do. For instance, if, you know, the road department was spending something silly on something that really didn't relate to the roads, you know, again, that would be part of the review. We want to make sure that they're spending the money appropriately. And I didn't mean to pick on the road department in particular, but, and so that process goes from, for the most part, the first part of March until the end of March. And then at the end of that process, my office, working with the city manager, we basically compile all the adjustments, look to see that it matches what we want it to be in terms of revenue equal expenditures, and all of the other departments doing what is really looked for. And once that is all done, then we create the city manager proposed budget. And again, this is submitted to the city commission on the 3rd Monday of April. One of the considerations in the budget process, there is a city commission policy that says the general fund will maintain between 15 and 20% of the previous year's amended expenditure budget as a fund balance reserve, basically a dollar amount to have us fall back on if something significant happens that we really have to dip into reserves. COVID was a good example. We didn't get hit that bad for COVID, but you know, a pandemic would be a similar type situation. For this coming fiscal year, the reserve amount will need to be between 3.8 million and 5.1 million. Now, if, for instance, we made those projections and the last year's fund balance came out to 3.4 million, as an example, what we would probably do would be to make recommendations that this next year's budget process would have excess revenues over expenditures of approximately $400,000, so that at the end of 25-26, we would underspend the budget. That underspending would go into fund balance and build that balance up to within our 15 to 20% level. What is nice to know is that for this coming fiscal year, it will not be a consideration considering the amount that we have in the fund balance at this point in time. So we're going to try to balance the budget. We're not going to try to have excess revenues or excess expenditures. We are going to try to balance the budget, which has been the goal, frankly, since I've been here. City Commission, and we leave you guys to ponder with that information for at least a few weeks. And then we typically go ahead and set up meetings with the city commission. And those meetings include, obviously, myself, the city manager, and then all of the different department heads where involving those departments. And again, the meetings have been scheduled to review the budget. The first meeting, typically we've set up 3 meetings. The first meeting is to discuss all the general fund budgets, all the departments in the general fund. The second or third meeting, depending on how it all works out, is to discuss the utilities, electric, sewer, and water. And then the last meeting, or potentially the second meeting, is to discuss all the remaining budgets, which includes streets, public improvement, all the internal service funds, sanitation fund, all of the other departments except general fund and then the 3 utilities. So then we go through that process, and any adjustments that the city commission wants to make, ultimately what we always find somewhere in there is, and I hate to admit it, occasional errors in some of the calculations and computations, and we fix all of those. And eventually we make all the changes and eventually bring back an adopted budget to be basically approved by this board no later than June 30th, and that's pursuant to state law. It has to be adopted prior to the beginning of the next year's budget. And I don't know that, at least in my tenure, we've ever had to have a special meeting or anything like that.
Prior to you, we had to have a couple like that last day. We don't ever want to get to that last day.
I've had meetings on where it's the last day before Christmas when it was a fiscal calendar year. And gets a little too nerve-wracking. It's, and
How difficult is that on staff to not know your budget until the day before the fiscal year?
to be honest, the amount of changes between what is submitted in the proposed budget in the 3rd week of April and the adopted budget that is adopted end of June has been relatively minimal. There hasn't been huge differences between those budgets. So it hasn't really been a hardship for the departments. Again, what you will get from the city manager and myself is a balanced budget. So, you know, it's going to have revenues equal expenditures for general fund. And kind of going back to what I was talking about in terms of fund balance policy, 15 to 20%, that hasn't been too much of an issue for the general fund recently, but for some of the smaller departments, what'll happen is they'll come in, or other funds, they'll come in with revenues of, say, $1 million and expenditures of $2 million, and they only got $500,000 in their fund balance. So the numbers don't come out. And, you know, it's part of our job to say, this isn't gonna work, folks. You need to make at least $500,000 in cuts so that revenues plus your fund balance equals your expenses. But that's not all that great of an idea to basically budget to have zero fund balance in a fund. Well, I don't ever remember doing that. So, you know, those are some of the considerations that will go into before you folks ever see it, but also, you know, some of the considerations that we'll have to take into account as we move forward with the budget process. And as in past years, the budget will be presented in a summary format. We do not do a line item budget. It basically is just, all you're doing is looking at the weeds. Okay, funds. This is where the real differences in governmental work compared to for-profit work comes into play. To comply with the state of Michigan laws as well as GAAP for a governmental unit, the city has an accounting system comprised of 48 different funds. So we have 48 little funds that are self-balancing accounting entries that have their own balance sheet and they have their own separate revenues, expenses or expenditures, and separate budgets. So it's not just creating a city budget. The city budget is comprised of many, many different parts. The fund types are, first off, we have just one general fund. We have 12 special revenue funds, and special revenue funds are funds that are created to fund kind of a specific purpose. So examples are the local street fund, the major street fund. We also have the sanitation fund. We have CDBG, building department has a separate fund, et cetera, et cetera. We also have component units. So this is like the DDA, the Brownfield Authority, Marquette District, Tifa, Midland Street Management Board, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all of those smaller programs, although the brownfield programs are actually pretty big by themselves, but some of them are much smaller. Debt service funds. Debt service funds are a creation typically to satisfy a bond covenant that says what we will do is fund a debt service fund with the funds necessary to make a debt service payment at some point in the future. Right now we have two funds in particular, or two things that we fund through that. There's an HVAC bond payment due on this building, and then also pretty much all of the funds associated with the uptown development. Those go through a bond or go through a debt service fund. Capital projects, the most evident program here is the Public Improvement Fund. We put money in that fund to do capital improvements. It may be park improvements, the marina we've spent a lot of money on recently. And let's see, we've also funded, I believe, some of the cemetery improvements as well as, some of the other things through there.
Look on the capital projects funds. That was where you said last meeting we would park if we had excess reserves, put them in capital projects and find a good project for them.
Historically, we have taken almost 100% of the excess general fund reserves, or that fund balance amount, and moved it into the Public Improvement Fund just for different projects. And again, what we were talking about is probably setting up a good size fund for public safety, building improvements. Because we know between PFAS and various other things that there's going to be some necessary dollars spent.
It might be the number of projects we did.
We just did not transfer the amount as of the fiscal year ended June 30th of 2023. We did not move that fund, that dollar amount, into the Public Improvement Fund. There was adequate dollars to fund the projects that we knew were coming up. So it basically sat in general fund for another year. And enterprise funds, the water, sewer, and electric utility are our biggest enterprise funds, and in some cases, our biggest fund. But then we also have the airport is an enterprise fund, the cemetery, as well as the marina. So those funds. And then we have some 15 internal service funds. Enterprise funds, just to maybe kind of go back there a little bit. What distinguishes an enterprise fund is that that fund basically bills out its costs specifically to be a self-sustaining fund, or for the most part. So, for instance, the electric utility fund, that we send out roughly 20,000 bills every month to pay for the electric that we are selling. Same way with the water fund, same way with the sewer fund. Getting into some of the smaller funds, the marina, basically what they do is they charge, a annual fee for a seasonal slip rental and day charges for other rentals. The enterprise, the cemetery basically charges for sale of the lots, et cetera. And the airport, same way, they have various charges for some of their operation. Internal service funds are funds which are created to, for the most part, provide services for the other funds within the entity. So for instance, some of the funds that you're going to see are the MRF fund, which is our motor equipment revolving fund. So all of the trucks, all of the cars, pretty much all of the vehicles that are purchased by the city to provide city services, such as road plowing, our police cruisers, et cetera, they are sort of technically owned by the MRF. The MRF is they buy the fund, or they buy the vehicle, and then they rent it out to the other departments at a cost that pays for all of the maintenance. All the departments do pay for their own gasoline, but then it also pays to ultimately replace the vehicle. Now, there's some difficulty between matching those up on an ongoing basis, but nonetheless, that's the purpose of that fund. Trying to think of the other fund that's more of a recent creation is the DPW building fund. The DPW building was just, we purchased the building a few years back, and then just a couple of years ago, we did $14 million in renovations, and now that department, or that building, now rents space to sanitation, to the street funds, to the MRF funds, to the water fund, all the different DPW functions, and all of those individual programs pay the DPW building fund to pay for the cost of the utilities, the upkeep, as well as, quite frankly, making a debt service payment on that $14.5 million bond. And last but not least, we have two trust funds. And the two trust funds are let me see if I can get the name right, Public Safety and Fire Pension Fund, as well as the Retiree Healthcare Trust Fund. And the Public Safety and Fire Retirement Pension Fund is specifically set up to pay benefits to our retired police and fire staff. And in fact, I'll get into it a little bit later. The money that we put into that fund, we don't have the option of taking that money back out unless we want to violate state law and probably get a lawsuit from the pension board and probably from police and fire employees.
things with that.
Yeah, exactly. There are very harsh penalties for robbing trust funds. Same way with the retiree healthcare fund. That is a trust fund, just like police and fire or the pension fund. And the dollars that are in that fund are accumulated to basically pay retiree healthcare costs for eligible retirees. And this fund isn't just, that fund isn't just related to police and fire. It also covers general employees that were hired before 2010, 2012, somewhere in there. Current employees basically get a, like a 401 defined benefit, or defined contribution style retiree healthcare plan.
The defined benefit plan. What percent, assuming that it's an estimate on what's out?
We actually have 3 different defined benefit pension plans. We have, well, I'm sorry, 2. We have the police, public safety, and fire pension plan. And that's roughly 67%, I think, 68% funded. Then we have an older plan that was actually terminated back in '98. That is the MERS plan, Municipal Employees Retirement System, and that was for general employees. And at this point, that system has only about 5 current active employees. It's just about, there's almost everybody in that plan has pretty much retired. And at this point, I think the last number as of, I don't think we've seen 12/31/24, but as of 12/31/23, it was, I think, 97 or 98% funded. So, yeah. Yeah. The only contributions that we'll be making is probably contributions associated with, basically taking a hard hit on the investments and stuff like that. We will continue to make contributions, but they are going to be much smaller than what we're seeing put into the public safety and fire, as well as the retiree health fund. Retiree health trust, I think we're at about 67%. 10 years ago, we were at, I think, 4 or 5%. So we've done.
4 or 5%, not 40?
Nope, 4 or 5%. We've really worked hard to fund it with contributions, but fortunately, our returns have been fairly good, fairly well as well. So that plan is something that I'm kind of proud of, to be honest. And this kind of gets to a little bit down further in terms of restricted, but generally, with the exception of the general fund, revenues collected by each fund are generally for the exclusive use of that fund. And we'll get into that a little further. So the general fund. The general fund is the government's primary operating fund that accounts for all activities that aren't required to be accounted for in other funds. And this is actually the GFOA definition of the general fund, because it's kind of vague, to be honest, but it is. The general fund provides the following services. General government, that would include like my department, the city manager, the assessor, the clerk's office, what you would consider to be admin departments. Public safety, obviously, police and fire. Public works is like no, it's construction and engineering, so our engineering department. Street lighting is considered, that's part of street lighting. neighborhood maintenance, and city hall and grounds. So the department that takes care of this building. Community and economic development, this is our economic development department. Recreation and culture, obviously our parks division. And then transfer out to other funds. Again, the general fund provides subsidies for some of the funds that really don't quite make it, such as the airport, the cemetery, and the marina as examples. So we transfer out to those funds. And the general fund services are funded with the following revenue sources. So property taxes, which basically we have about almost $15 million in tax revenue, but this includes the marijuana revenues. Licenses and permits, this is a lot of the things that comes through our clerk's office, about $612,000. Federal grants, most of the federal grants that we see flowing through the general fund are generally related to our public safety department, burn grants and things like that. Relatively smaller, about $201,000. State grants, on the other hand, this includes state revenue sharing, and we are budgeted at $6.5 million for this current fiscal year. Local grants, $400,000. This is actually the Chancellor donation for the Arboretum, so part of our parks. Charges for services, this is about $3.6 million, and the biggest number in there is the city does a cost allocation plan for all of the functions that the general fund provides to all of the other departments. So the cost of accounting services, the cost of purchasing services for the water fund, the electric fund, the sewer fund, and that's billed back to those departments, and the indirect cost allocation is about $2.8 million. Fines, I would guess that's some of the things that we see coming out of public safety. Interest and rents, we've got a budget for about $180,000. Quite frankly, we budget that conservatively because we kind of don't know what's going to happen. We've had significantly better results than what we budgeted in the last couple of years. Other is just a lot of miscellaneous different things. Other sources is an amount that we would use, for instance, if we use fund balance, we would recognize the use of fund balance in that category. But for the general fund in the current fiscal year, we've got $500 in there. So it's not fund balance. It's just some miscellaneous thing. And then transferred in from other funds, we've got about $1.22 million in there. And I'm struggling for some of the things that we get in there. Oh, I know. Some of the park projects that are funded with transfers from CDBG. That's one of the largest. That's one of the larger ones. And now getting into the restricted funds. As a general rule, all funds except general fund are reserved or restricted for the purpose of that fund. For example, and this is an example I wanted to use, the rates that are charged to city customers for trash collection is reserved for the cost associated with the collection of that trash. So for instance, I believe the monthly rate is around $18. We charge that to all of our trash customers. It would be inappropriate at best, borderline maybe illegal, for, let's just say, to make that fund, just transfer a couple $100,000 to the general fund. Because what we would be doing would be subsidizing the general fund with the cost that we charge out to the different individuals for trash collection. And even though we've actually gone the other way, when we had some problems with that fund generating enough revenues, the general fund actually made a contribution into the fund. We haven't asked it for it back yet and probably won't. But and the other thing too is, let's say for instance, at the end of the year, we have $2.4 million in revenue and $2.1 million in expenditures. That extra $300,000 that we kind of overbilled customers, that goes into there, it stays into that fund and is then used by that fund for future years. So let's say, for instance, the next year, the cost of that fund go up by $500,000. So, and we only bill 1.8 million or $1.8 million out. So we can use those excess revenues in future years to balance the fund out. It is, those dollars stay in the fund.
Goes into the red. Transfer from the general fund.
Even if it goes into the red, if we don't do that transfer before the end of the year, part of my job is to write this wonderful letter to the state of Michigan explaining why this happened and why we're not going to do it again, and that we're very sorry, et cetera, et cetera.
Doesn't
One
like
of the
those letters.
one of the more undesirable things that I like to
Yeah.
do. I think I've done them for $200.
Yeah.
So I think what happens is the auditors basically have to answer a question on their audit filing. It says, were any funds in a deficit situation? If they answer yes, I get a letter within about a day. It's very, very quick. In addition to that general restriction, there can be formally restricted funds. For instance, the City Commission restricted the use of the proceeds of the bridge lease, the $5 million, to be used exclusively for road projects. That's what it's restricted for right now. Obviously, this commission could go ahead and change that restriction, but, and again, the other thing is, based on policy, there's about 3.8 to 5.1 million of general fund balance that is restricted. We wouldn't want to be dipping into that because that's our policy. And then, of course, and we've talked about this, the public safety, the pension fund, as well as retiree healthcare fund, you just don't dip into them without literally legal ramifications. That is by far the most restrictive of anything. And you don't have any options on that. That's not something that you can just decide to change it.
So we do have the option of putting more money in to get it closer to 100%, correct?
And we've done that.
Yes, I
Yes.
just want to make sure that we do have the option, but it's only putting money in.
You can, for the most part, we are legally obligated kind of to contribute at least the actuarially determined contribution. On the retiree healthcare, that's not a legal requirement yet. But we have, historically, we've contributed more. And in fact, it's to the point now where, because we've contributed so much more, the investment revenues have actually started decreasing our required contributions and I'm not talking by $50 or $100,000, they're down about $3 million in the last several years. Big dollars.
I see, that we still have that $5 million from the bridges, is that what I saw?
Yes.
Okay, now, what are we sitting on that money for, what?
It's specifically designated for road improvements.
Okay, now, we did have money, set aside for that, the roads and the sidewalks and all this other stuff. So why is it that we just keep saying that over and over again?
We have not dipped into that $5 million.
Right.
The other projects that we have done in the past, either road or sidewalk projects, were either funded out of, street revenues from the state of Michigan, or CDBG has contributed to sidewalks, et cetera. So we've used those dollars.
One more question. Thing is that we're only getting out of a lot of the money, like the weed money. We're only getting sidewalks done. I haven't seen any, we've had promise after promise of using funding to the side streets. There hasn't been any done since I sat down. We've only had like Columbus, Washington Street, these type of, street stuff. And so I'm not getting this over and over again, being told that we're getting these streets done when I'm just seeing curves. So I wanna know where's that, why are we being told over and over, and this money is just sitting there, and every year it's just, we're being told the same thing, so we need to use some of that money, that's what.
We have been doing street projects. The book basically includes that. And
We did 7 or 8 last year.
So-
Or 8 large street projects.
Oh, yeah, that was Columbus and all these other streets, I'm saying side streets, like where neighborhoods are. We wanna see, we're not driving our kids to school on, we don't wanna fall in drop holes, we would like our neighborhoods done, we're not trying to go uptown, we're not trying to use, Washington Avenue all the time, we're trying to drive out of our driveways without falling in
Does the,
ditches.
excuse me, does the Downtown Development Authority pay their own streets? They use their own money for it, or?
back in, I believe, 2017, the DDA, or the Water Street DDA, did commit to a 50% cost match with the city for some of the downtown roads. They set that up over a, I believe it was a 10-year bond.
But it's not all the time.
It's not all the time, simply because they used up almost all of the funds that program
I
used.
had one other thing I wanted to ask. The city has a revolving fund for vehicles.
Yes,
Are fire trucks included in that?
yes,
They are.
they are.
Like,
Oh,
you want to
I-
say something? Fred?
Yeah, I was just to be clear, the $5 million is there until we decide what to do for it, and that's why
It
it's
is
still
there.
sitting there.
Yep.
Yes.
Just wanted to make sure I'm clear on that. And we had discussed about the city engineer coming in early so we could discuss side streets.
Right.
And
She's on the
what-
schedule to present to us.
And when is that?
I don't have it with me.
I think
My other
March,
book
you
for-
mentioned when I.
Was it
reached-
March?
Yeah,
Okay.
so we're getting
Yeah, it
ready
is
to
March.
talk about side,
Yes.
neighborhood streets.
So what it comes down to, we could vote to spend that money on the streets if we wanted to?
It's already allocated for the street, so yes.
No, I mean more money.
It's
If it's available, I'm thinking.
the five,
We'd have to put a proposal forward. You don't call it proposal, I still don't have it. Resolution. My world is a proposal, but,
Let's do it.
so we could, well.
After that
Yeah.
presentation.
Yeah.
I suggest waiting for her to present, and then
Yeah,
she
see.
can explain the cost of just not the road, but what's under the roads for water and sewer, because that's
Well,
where your big cost is.
That's where it gets tricky because
Right.
there's this milling process.
Yep.
Oh, we could lay asphalt
Yep.
till hell freezes over, but there's pipes that are collapsing underneath.
And we don't wanna do mill and fill on a
And,
street, and
you know,
next year it falls apart.
side streets and local streets.
But
But
We just need to do the
Well,
same
there's more
thing we
than
do
an appetite.
uptown. We need to do what they have up here. We need
no,
to do it,
I know that.
you know, the
We didn't
same
do
thing
those.
they have up here, we need to do it in our neighborhoods. We don't need to do better there. We need to do the same
that's what I mean.
here.
We're doing side streets.
I think we're on the same page.
But I think
Yeah.
we're running on, we're getting running
Yeah,
close,
got a
so-
couple minutes here, George.
Okay,
to
I
pass
will-
through.
Move this quickly. Okay, the budget book is organized into the following sections. We have a budget letter that is prepared by the city manager. It talks about what maybe, what's in the budget and what are some of the big changes, maybe significant projects, et cetera. And, but then, starting on Roman numeral page 10, we have a summarization of all of the revenues by fund and department, as well as expenditures by fund and department. And then starting on page 2 are the actual individual departmental budgets, which show, like, for instance, the revenues that they generate specifically, as well as their personnel costs, their fringe benefits, their other services, which includes like all of their all professional services, et cetera, any type of capital outlay, debt service. So there's, again, a specific budget for each one of those departments. And then on page 138 is a schedule showing personnel by position or number of positions for each individual department. And then on, starting on page 150 is a detail of all of our outstanding debt issuances. So for instance, it lists each individual debt and also has the amortization schedule as well as what the bond was issued for. And does not say what the current balance is on it, but the information is there. And then starting on page 188, we have the 5-year capital outlay program for all of the different funds and departments, including the utilities, streets, et cetera. And then finally on page 198, and this is only in the adopted budget book, there will not be one of these in the proposed budget book that you'll get in April. There is the resolution that actually adopts the city budget. So that'll be included in the adopted budget book for 2025/2026 that you'll probably get sometime in early July. And with that, I will,
I got one. Fringes, what's the definition of fringe?
fringe benefits, we have, the city offers medical insurance, dental insurance, self-funded vision insurance. We also have disability and accidental death, as well as, let's see, workers' comp.
That's good, that's.
Basically, defined benefit, defined contribution retirement for most employees, as well as most employees now have the retiree healthcare trust. So we contribute X amount of their payroll into a self-directed fund that they can use to pay medical costs, medical insurance plans, et cetera.
Thank you.
Talked about last meeting, payment in lieu of taxes. We're talking about here, funds are restricted to each individual. Less. Taxes, is that? How would somebody do that?
Well, payment in lieu of taxes there's a couple of different areas that we get it, but the largest one is the electric utility. And for example, and this is where it kind of equalized, typically, most governments have electric utilities that are provided by Consumers Power or DTE, and those, all of their infrastructure, all of their personal property is their lines, their poles, and all that kind of stuff are taxable. And normally, a government has significant tax revenues associated with that infrastructure. Because the electric utility here is run by the city, to kind of equalize that, as well as to get the city to be reimbursed for the cost of providing all the infrastructure costs associated, that is associated with that, we do what's called a payment in lieu of taxes. And that is the way that we do it here at the city is it's X percentage, I believe 6% of gross revenues for the electric utility.
We're just pretending that, let's say,
Yep.
and they're paying those costs to the GF
Yep.
because that's what they would.
Yes.
All right, any other questions? If not, we're gonna wrap up and we're gonna head back downstairs.
And then we're gonna come back up here for executive session after the first presentation.
Okay. Oh,
Thank you.
All right, I
and
gotta
I
go get
said,
my stuff.
thank you.
No, that excites me, yeah. You got it, you got it.
Well, before this meeting, I was listening to
eBay.
the applause from the presentations downstairs, and I was kind of hoping for the same thing up here, so.
I did have a question for you,
Yes, sir.
last meeting, we talked about how there was a surplus in GF that was about 2 million. 1.6 of that, is that from the state enhancement grant that we got, or is that just increased tax revenue, that growth that we were not anticipating?
No, that state enhancement grant has nothing to do with that.
Okay, all right.
1.6 million.
That's what, when I saw that,
And I believe that 1.6 million came in after the end of last fiscal year. And I also believe that we put it into the street fund, because ultimately the street fund is the one who's going to have to pay the